Welcome to the Senior View. And today we have something very special. The Historical Society, we have two guests. We have John Palmer and we have Gail Clifford. And they are part of the Historical Society. And they're going to tell us the story of the Town Common. The Town Common was a very special place in each town. As people moved in and towns became born, let's put it that way. And so we're going to learn about the history of the Hopkinton Town Common. So Gail, would you like to start?
Sure. I'll talk a little bit about the New England towns. The earliest towns always had a common. It wasn't called a common then. It was usually referred to as the training field. The town center was very important to all of these towns because this is where everything took place. The meeting house was there. The meeting house was the early church, and the meeting house was also used for town activities and town government activities because in those days there was no separation of church and state. Everything took place together. The cemeteries, early cemeteries, were usually on the common or near the common. And as I said before, it was also known as the training field. And this is one interesting tidbit, is that in the earliest times, the towns had local militia, and they needed space to come together and do their training. And there was one day in May called May Training Day, and I think it varied between towns. And this was a day that all able-bodied men would come to the common, and they would do exercising arms and trials of marksmanship. And it was also a religious holiday, so it started out with prayers and the singing of psalms, and then afterward it became social, and they had dinner. Probably the women cooked the dinner while the men were working. Later on, after the Revolution, it became much more of a social event, and it pretty much disappeared. But the other reason for commons was for social gatherings around activities. In those days, people were scattered. You know, Hopkinton was wilderness. And these people had to make a living. They had to eke out a living. They were farmers, they owned mills. They didn't have a lot of social time, so this was a gathering place, and they would come together for the various activities. And in the 1800s, it became more popular to have a park as opposed to utilitarian space, we'll call it. So Hopkinton pre-1710 was a wilderness. It was rocky, it was hilly, it was swampy. The original road into town was the old Connecticut Path, also known as the Bay Path. And this was 1600s mostly. They would come through town on their way to the western part of the state or to Hartford, Connecticut. That's why it's called Connecticut Path. They came up Franklin Road, pretty much what it is today, and when they got to the East Main Street's hill, you know, there's a lot of ledge along that hill. They skirted the hill to the north, and they were in enough uplands down there that they could get away from the swamp that's down there. But they followed the path of least resistance, whatever it was. Then, of course, as we all know from the 300th being celebrated 2 years ago, that the town was incorporated in 1715. So I'm going to do a little bit of a timeline here to show you that even in those days, the wheels of government were not necessarily well-oiled. Things happened slowly. Now, we know that the town, the land for the town was bought by the charity, the trustees for the charity of Edward Hopkins. They owned the land. They bought, when it was bought, they called it waste land. It was waste land west of where the Indians were in the Natick area. And in December, they incorporated the town of Hopkinton. And there were probably about that time about 30 families living here. So now, a couple years later, within a couple of years, they set up a committee to build some roads. But no one had yet made a decision on where the town center was going to be. So why go to the time and trouble of making a road if you didn't know where it was going to go? So there's one little pause. So about 1720, now this is 5 years after the incorporation, the trustees donated land to the town. Up until that point, you leased the land, you did not buy it. They donated 100 acres that was to be used for the school, any schools, the training field, cemetery, and where the meeting house was going to be. And what they did was choose the side of the hill that is the highest by the high school. And this is like the lower part below the hill, but above the really steep and rocky place. Okay? So, 100 acres, 100 acres. They also did this because they wanted to keep things moving in the town, and they wanted to encourage more settlers. The problem is, settlers didn't want to lease the land. They wanted to buy their land. Why work a farm on land that you have to pay for? It was like a penny an acre, British money, no American money then. And leasing was not popular. Leasing was definitely not popular. So now we're 8 years after incorporation. We're in 1723. There's about 42 families in town. And these 42 families finally got together and said, okay, let's do this thing. We are going to petition the trustees to go to the general court so that we can legally elect town offices. So that's what they did, 1723. And in 1724, they finally had their first town meeting in March. And they elected offices, 5 selectmen and a town treasurer, various constables, and the town clerk. That was another one. And then, here we are. We have a town. We have a town. Okay, now what do? We need roads. We need a meeting house. So in 1725, they tried to decide on a place for the meeting house. There were all kinds of suggestions. We had a lot of land, remember. We had a lot of places to choose. Well, they finally came down to 3 places, and they had to have a ballot to decide which one. And nobody can really pinpoint where the meeting house actually went up, because the way they described it when they decided on what it was the location of a walnut tree that was marked on 2 sides. Now, where that walnut tree was, who knows? But all we do know for sure is that it was south of the cemetery. So the meeting house was built. It was going to be wood. It was 45 feet on 2 sides, and sources vary. It was either 35 or 38 feet on the other 2 sides. And they had a very interesting way of constructing it. They constructed the sides of the building on the ground. And then they lifted them up, and this required a lot of men with these pike poles to lift them up, and then they had to be fastened together. And then, of course, the roof, and finish it off, put the windows in, do the outside. It was major construction.
The raising event was a big deal because I've read many times about the raising. And on this one, they had a big celebration afterwards. After it was raised, the women had prepared supper for the men, and it was a major event.
And this was in December.
The raising
of that year. So they didn't have their first meeting until June of next year. And it still took them until 1730 to totally finish the building, inside and out. And inside the building, there were galleries. It was a two-story building, by the way. And there were galleries around 3 sides. The pulpit was in the center of the north side of the building. In the center, had a sounding board, and it was a semicircular sounding board like this behind the pulpit, and a window or several windows. We've never seen the back side of this. And then there were 2 tiers of seats. There was 1 tier for the men and 1 tier for women. And then in the back, there were extra seats, and these were for out-of-town visitors, servants, slaves, whoever else would want to attend. My understanding of the early church is that you had to be a member. You had to be accepted as a member. So if you weren't a member, you could still come, but you had to sit back.
The part that I've struggled with, and I finally have gotten it through my skull, we talk about the first meeting house, and on the town's flag, its emblem has the first meeting house. And I'm involved in town government, and I always thought this was at the first, like town hall, but it isn't. A meeting house in those days was basically a church. It was a place to conduct everything, but mainly religious services. And so this petition that went in 1723 to get permission to establish a center of the town so they can build their meeting house was so they could pray. I think secondarily they could conduct town business, or town business, secular matters, but the religious matters came first. But it was one and the same. It was all together, and that concept is hard to grasp in today's time. But it was like that was the way life was, and it wasn't unusual. That was the way it all was.
That's right.
So, one thing that might be interesting is this is the actual petition that was written in this is a photocopy of it, but it's the actual petition that was sent in 1723, written in 1723, asking for the trustees to petition the general court to give the inhabitants of Hopkinton the right to choose town offices and to establish their center. How we got this, I have no idea, but this is a photocopy, and it's got the names of 40.
It'd be interesting to read the names.
It's got the names of 42 inhabitants on it, and some of the names are familiar.
Yeah.
Can you read some?
Yeah, I can read a few of them.
Yes.
We've got Ebenezer Lute. We've got John Wood, John Howe, Benjamin Carroll, Joseph Haven, Ralph Hemingway, Daniel Stone, John Butler, Isaac Whitney, Peter Howe, Robert, I think it's Hamilton, Hugh Black, John Bowker is a name, Francis Pierce, Philip Code, Henry Mellon, Ebenezer Giles, and many others. There's Thomas Cook. There's a McDonough in here. There's a Hayden, a Hamilton, a couple of Hamiltons. So
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, the spelling in those days wasn't the best either. But you can read it.
Neither was the handwriting.
You can read it if you can read it phonetically, then you know what they were saying.
Yeah.
But anyways.
And isn't it interesting that some relatives, are still living here?
Yeah,
that
could very well be.
Could very well be is
Yes.
right.
Oh, sure. Those like the Bowker name.
That's right.
Yeah.
McDonough.
The McDonough name, yeah. So, and Hamilton.
Oh, thank you for doing that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So, in the old days, we didn't have a lot of photographs, but we did have a young lady, I assume she was young, in 1805. Her name was Sally Dupee or Dupay, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. She did a pen and ink drawing of the Meeting House and what we know now as the Price Manor House, the brick house across the street. And this is the sketch that was redone from her pen and ink drawing
Beautiful.
by a Mrs. Weston, and I don't know when she did that. But this is the drawing that has become the center of our town seal. And here is, it's a little harder to see in the color. I think the sketch is a little more detailed.
Oh, beautiful.
But that's the town seal. So this is the Meeting House, right here. This is
That's
the Meeting
on the
House.
right-hand side.
Yes,
yeah?
see, it's a two-story.
Yes, yes.
So how many times have I seen the town seal? Hundreds.
Without even
I
Hundreds,
know.
and no idea what was in there till you start really focusing.
Yes.
And so, it's interesting. You learn a lot. You learn a lot.
And this is 1805, so these buildings were there. These buildings were there, and that's really the only depiction that we have of the actual Meeting House. It was there until 1830, and it was moved. They saved old buildings in those days. They just moved them around. So this one got moved over to the Valentine Estate across the street and became a barn. And then I think later on I read that it went down somewhere behind where Colellis was, and it became part of a boot factory, or somebody's factory. I don't know if it was boot or not. So, and the other thing that happened on the Common was the very first school was actually on the Common in probably the southwest corner of what the Common is now. That wasn't until 1734 when the town decided that they better set up schools. And they did three. They did one on Franklin Road, they did one in Woodville, and they did the one on the Common. And Henry Ward Beecher, who became that abolitionist preacher, well known, he taught for a short while in 1832. And it may have been this building in which he taught. And later on, after they didn't use it as a school anymore, it got moved up to Hayden Row, and eventually it's part of a residence there. It became part of a boot factory up there, and on the second floor was a hat factory. And I forget the name of the person who had bought it as a residence originally, but he found all kinds of hat-making stuff up there on the second floor. Unfortunately, I hear that he threw most of it away, but we didn't have a historical society in those days. So anyway, it still exists in a very small way down at Hayden Row somewhere.
Very good.
My turn.
So the part that really kind of fascinated me in this little presentation is trying to understand the dimensions of the Common, what it looked like in the 1700s, 1800s, and today, and what changes have occurred. And so there's a number of maps at the Historical Society that you can refer to, but the oldest ones in the 1800 or earlier, they don't give you the complete dimension of the Common, other than the fact that there's two parallel roads which probably would be Hayden Row and Ash Street. But they don't show you how far it goes. But we believe the Common extended further than it does today. Because
It was 100 acres.
it was 100 acres. It was used as a training field for military purposes. It was used for agricultural purposes. So it was more extensive. And on the north side, we know it would stop at the church cemetery, but we don't know. I think it probably went up to the cemetery, perhaps, because the roads weren't in. But beginning in the 1800s, the dimensions of the Common are basically the same as now. It bordered Main Street on the north, Ash and Hayden Row on the sides, and the street going behind it, which is now Park Street. It wasn't always Park Street, but it's Park Street now. And that is what it looks like. Then I got into the not only what happened, we call it Park Street, but the old maps always refer to it as Common Street. So at some time, it changed from Common to Park. Research indicates, I have a map that's 1875, and it's the street below the Common right here is Common Street. That's 1875.
Okay.
This one is 1889, but it does not have a street name. They don't have street names on it. So I couldn't get it up beyond 1875. Yes, I can. This map is a little different map. That has, this is 1880, and it still says Common Street. So now Gail found out in researching town listings, that street names, street listings, in 1900, it was called Park Street. So someplace between 1880 and 1900, the name changed. Don't know why. But that type of thing is interesting to me. But I don't know if anybody's, well, but there's a reason for that change.
Yes,
You know, and
yes.
I think the reason is probably because it's now a park. And before it was the so-called town common, which was used for multi-purposes.
So it changed.
So it changed. So the name got changed. So somebody did that. But then when I got into those old maps, even the one in even this first one, which is this goes back to 1870. This is 1880. Shows the crosshatch, the two diagonals on the common that we have now.
Right, yes it does. Yeah.
And this one in 1875 has the crosshatches.
I
But
see, yeah.
but what's interesting is this one in 1880 does not have the crosshatches.
No, it doesn't.
Now this is an aerial view. I don't think it's a photograph, but it's an aerial view. And the crosshatches aren't there. So that's, I started to say, well, maybe it was always planned to have two diagonals, but it never happened. And then at some point it may have happened. And that's a mystery, which, I'd be interested to know how this happened, if anybody is aware of it. That would be great to learn that. And that further complicate this this quandary, we actually have two photographs that that are particularly interesting. This one, I have it blown up on two views of it. I call this the man with the dog photo. This is 1880. We know it's 1880 because the church in the background is the second meeting house that was destroyed by fire in 1882.
Yes, I read that.
So that church was this photo had to be before 1882. We think it was 1880. I don't see two crosswalks in that.
No, I don't either.
And and I do see these two nice rows of trees, but I don't see rows of trees for another diagonal crosswalk. the aerial view that saw a minute ago has trees on both ways, but the photograph doesn't show that.
I understand.
That is
That's a mystery.
Well, that's a
That's a
mystery.
mystery.
That got my curiosity.
Okay.
And-
Well, we only have a few minutes left, and we're going to do a part 2 on this because it's so interesting and it's so important for us to share this with the community. So thank you, John. Thank you, Gail, so much. I appreciate the hard work that you put into this, believe in me. And we thank you for watching, and we're going to invite you back for a part 2. Have a good night.
Facing life's difficulties takes strength and determination. Whether it's physical challenges or struggles you can't see, it takes strength to ask for help when you need it. Learn how other veterans have reached out for help and hear their stories of strength and recovery at maketheconnection.net.
United Way fights for the health, education, and financial stability of every person in every community. Will you?